Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jessica with Bat B&B. Bat B&B is creators of safe, sustainable, and stylish bat houses. And in just a moment, we're going to be joined by Dr. Merlin Tuttle and talk a little bit about the Bat House Guide that Merlin just released. So as you're joining, say hello, tell us where you're joining from. We're going to make sure to add Merlin on here in just a minute. Oh, hello, everyone. Gotham Bat Conservancy. Hi, guys. Oh, thanks for joining. Hi, Em. Thanks for being here. Let me get Merlin on here. All right. As you're joining, let us know where you're watching from. We'll talk all things bats and bat houses. If you have any questions for Merlin, go ahead and put them into our chat here. Marilyn, hello.
Hi, Jessica. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm just fine.
So what do you have going on these days? What are you working on?
Well, last weekend I was up in Ohio photographing some really incredibly nice bat habitat in the eastern part of the state, the edge of the Appalachians. And this week I'll be working with pecan growers here in Texas who are using bat houses to reduce pest problems in pecan orchards. And we'll be doing a film with the Weather Channel on an ongoing experiment where we're documenting the impact of the bats.
Oh, interesting. Wow, well, you're always doing something. You always got so much going on. So we really appreciate your time today. So I wanted to dive right in, Merlin, and talk about your Bat House Guide.
Well,
Recently released. And
we're
what's
real
up?
happy with the success of that guide. It's been listed on Amazon as a bestseller among their nature books.
Absolutely, and we actually at Bat B&B just added some to our shop. You can get them through us now as well.
Great.
Yeah, I'm looking. We're getting some great questions coming in and some comments to you, Merlin. Maybe I'll just start with this question someone asked. This is a great lead into bat houses. This person is asking if bat houses need to be shaded or in the sun.
That depends on where you live. If you live in Texas, or if you live in a hot climate, you may want to have them more shaded, but we have learned here in the Austin area of Texas, we get some very big temperature shifts from day to night and seasonally. And we simply have learned to provide houses that provide a greater range of temperature so that the bats can move accordingly. But if you live, for example, in the northern United States or at a higher elevation, you will want to probably have a black bat house exposed to plenty of sun. Actually, we found that the most successful bat house users are people who have put up at least 2 or more houses, and especially if they put up 2 or more houses that have slightly different exposure to the sun. I remember a person in Arkansas years ago who put up a bat house in the shade of a tree, and years later he called me and said, he'd done his bat house right, but he didn't have any bats in it. And I suggested maybe he put up one nearby in the sun. He did, and very quickly he got a nursery colony of big brown bats that moved in, and they were there consistently every year for close to a decade. Then, and there never were any bats in the shaded house. But then one year they had an extreme heat wave, and all of his bats moved from the sunny house into the shaded house, and he might have lost his bats that year had he not given them the option of a house that they actually never used except in an emergency. Bats are used to living in snags in places. You know, snags blow down in storms, loose bark falls off. The bats are used to suddenly losing their homes. And so even if the houses aren't particularly different in temperature, just having options encourages them that this is a more secure place to live, because if something happens to one roost, perhaps they'll have another one available to move to quickly.
Yeah, and something you said in the Bat House Guide that was a good reminder for me was that their natural roosting locations aren't always without imperfections. So just having some different options for them. And like you said, if people are not seeing bats, a great option would be to add other options for the bats so that they are the most comfortable.
Well, every now and then somebody gets excited about seeing one or a few dead bats associated with a bat house, and they say, oh, we've killed the bats because we put the house where it was too hot or too cold or something is wrong. But what they don't understand is that even in the best of natural roosts, some bats don't make it. And if you get a really extreme weather event, even in the best of roosts, you may have some bats die. That's part of nature. We can't save every bat. If you put up a bat house that is wrong, bats are not going to use it unless they're desperate. And if they're desperate, it's still better than nothing.
Absolutely. And Merlin, I know I've asked you these questions a lot, but we have people ask us regularly, and I love to hear your take on this. Can you tell us why it's important to have a water source nearby for bats?
I don't think it's as much having the water source nearby as it is having diverse vegetation and insect life nearby. If the closer you are to a river or lake, the better as far as attracting bats. Usually, diverse vegetation is left along river or lake edges, and so you get a much bigger variety of insects hatching out. Certainly, bats do like to be able to drink out of a river or a lake, but it's not just drinking. I believe that just as much it has to do with always having food available. For example, in the Mediterranean, they did a study where they put up small bat houses strategically located around rice crops, and they found that over a few years they attracted enough bats that they no longer had to use pesticides to spray for certain kinds of pests. But those rice paddies were located near a national park which protected diverse habitat. And the authors of the paper concluded that their experiment probably would have failed had they not had the natural habitat nearby where the bats could go and find food in the off season when there were no pest insects to eat coming for crops.
That's so interesting. Yeah, so it's all about the biodiversity and the options out there for them in terms of food. What tips do you have for placement on bat houses, Merlin?
Well, first of all, people call me fairly regularly and want to know about putting up a very big bat house. They like the idea of having thousands of bats come out of a bat house. And I always caution against that. I caution, try putting up 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5, but test with smaller, less costly bat houses to find out what the potential is where you are. How do bats really need houses where you are? Are there bats already there? Sometimes there aren't many bats there, but over a period of years, you can build up the numbers. But first of all, experiment with smaller houses and try if possible, a diversity of locations. Might try a pair of them back to back on a pole, try one on the side of a building, try different types of locations, and especially different kinds of sun exposure, where the houses will be of different temperature. Then once you see that the bats are choosing a certain kind or a certain location, then you can build more of that type or placed in that type of location. I know of situations where bat house builders, for example, one in Wisconsin, first put up 3 bat houses in his yard, and he did it right, but he didn't get any bats in several years. No bats came. But then he read more of what I'd written about why bats choose certain places, and he realized that there was a state park not too far from him. He didn't live near very good feeding habitat for bats, but he went over and offered to put up bat houses on the state park property, and bats moved in right away. And he now, at a time when little brown bats populations are way down because of white nose syndrome, he now has several thousand of them in his houses. And in fact, in the last several years, his bats in his houses have grown by something like 70%. If you look at our website, there's a recent blog by him about his bats, and his bats are recovering very well from white nose syndrome, probably because they have a well protected ideal hibernation site not too far away. And his houses are located no better than the ones that weren't occupied in his yard, but located much closer to where the bats can find good feeding opportunities.
Okay.
And people like this, most of the people I know who now have thousands of bats start out as failures and just kept experimenting until they found what the bats needed in that location.
Absolutely. I received a video from one of our customers today. I'll have to send it to you. I'm going to post it here on Instagram tomorrow, Merlin. It's 2 back-to-back dual chamber bat houses on a post in Northwest Florida, and they have over 300 Brazilian free-tailed bats living in there, and they have an amazing video of the bats emerging from the bat house. It's really neat to get to watch.
It doesn't even take 100 bats to have something really neat to watch. We used a thermal imaging scope recently at one of our bat houses that we're testing in pecan orchards, and 35 bats coming out was quite an interesting video. And certainly if you get hundreds, you've got a spectacle that is going to be quite fascinating to observe in the evening.
Absolutely. So, of course, we're protecting these bats and providing habitat, but it's also a little bit of entertainment for us. It's enjoyment in seeing that conservation at work and seeing those bats utilize those habitats.
In my experience, the most frequent cause of major bat decline is loss of roosting sites. We have cut old growth forests. We've taken over their caves. The best bat caves were the large ones that had a lot of diversity, so that during different climate changes, the bats could simply move up or down in a single room sometimes and get the temperature they needed to hibernate. And then in the summer, they need snags and things that are close to diverse habitat, and very often that doesn't exist anymore. It's all miles of cultivated farmland or city or something else, and they don't have those options. In fact, it's my belief that white nose syndrome has killed so many in America because this came along as kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, our bats had lost so many options for roosts that they now had to travel much further and arrive at hibernation sites with less fat stores, hibernate where the temperature wasn't as good so that they burned fat faster, and it made them very vulnerable. So putting up bat houses and protecting not just bat houses, but putting up or restoring caves that they once hibernated in too. It's a combination. If you live too far from where bats can hibernate, you may not attract bats. But the good news is that even if you live too far from a hibernation site, there is at least one bat that's doing very well during this plague of white nose syndrome deaths, and that's the big brown bat. It can survive sub-freezing body temperatures. It can hibernate under tree bark in places where it gets extremely cold in winter. It can hibernate in attics and other places, and it is a frequent user of bat houses. And a study a few years ago in Wisconsin showed that, this bat, we had always thought that it ate mostly large insects, particularly beetles, because those were it's easier to find parts of a beetle in bat feces than it is parts of a mosquito. And so we'd always, if somebody had asked me what they ate, I'd say, well, probably mostly beetles. That was what we thought. But when barcoding, a type of genetic analysis of the feces, came along, it was found that this species was eating, and all these, this entire study was done on big brown bats and little brown bats living in bat houses. And it was found that the big brown bats were actually, in addition to the beetles we knew they ate, a large part of their diet was mosquitoes throughout the entire season, and it included 15 species of mosquitoes, 9 of which were carriers of West Nile virus.
Wow. Merlin, I'm not sure if I told you this, but just talking about big brown bats, I worked at a wildlife center that rescued injured animals, and we had a bat that became an educational ambassador, and we named him Merlin after you. So probably not the first or the last bat named after you, but when I think big brown bats, I always think of our bat named Merlin. Is it okay if I ask you a couple of these questions in the comments here?
Excuse, was that focused at, were you asking me a question or your audience a question?
Well, can I ask you some of the questions they're asking in the comments?
Sure.
One person's wondering, will the size of the bat house depend on your region?
Well, bat houses don't have to be large. It used to be, in fact, it still probably is a widespread belief that big bat houses are far more successful than smaller bat houses. That's not necessarily true. What is true is that bats like a range of temperature in a house, so the house needs to be at least probably close to 24 inches tall, with a vent down 3/4 of the way to the bottom, so that you get diverse temperature, with much hotter up near the top and cooler down at the bottom. And simple, even single chamber bat houses, if you put a couple of those up on the side of a house, you're probably just as likely to get bats in those as you are if you put up a bigger house. Now, you may fill that house quickly and need to add houses. I know of a case here in Texas where a 3-chamber house was put up, and within 1 week it had 105 bats in it. This was a case where the bats obviously were desperate and moved in very quickly. In cases like that, you can actually get situations where you may even have dozens of bats roosting on the outside of the bat house because they want to be with their buddies and can't get in. Certainly that's the case where you need to give them more shelter. But a well-made and positioned house can be single chamber. It can be, let's say, 2 feet tall and foot and a half or so wide. A very simple house that a child could build can attract bats just fine if it's placed well relative to solar exposure and temperature and habitat.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Our friends at Karchner Caverns in Arizona are saying that they are going to put a bat house in their museum, and wondering what you think the most important information they should include in that exhibit about bat houses.
Well, certainly bat houses are very beneficial in terms of reducing the number of pest insects in your yard. They're also invaluable educational tools. So many people these days are hearing that bats supposedly can give you everything from rabies to Ebola and COVID. The truth is that bats have one of the best track records in America when it comes to not transmitting disease to humans or other animals. In the United States, we hear a lot about rabies. Only 1 to 2 people annually in all of the United States and Canada combined contract rabies from a bat. And those are almost invariably people who picked up a sick bat. And I point out that you should never handle any sick animal. Certainly a bat that is out where you can pick it up in the daytime is very likely to be sick. Don't pick it up. Don't get bit. And if you do get bit in self-defense, check with your doctor. Rabies post-exposure vaccine is very safe and very effective. There really is almost nothing to worry about when it comes to disease from bats. It's just something that we hear a lot about that is greatly exaggerated by those who profit by our fear.
And I know you have some great resources on your website, merlintuttle.org, about diseases and communications around bats. I would send people towards that. We also have an education zone on our website, batbnb.com, that we created with Merlin, if anyone's looking for more information about that. Merlin, another question that has come through is what would you recommend for people that want to get started in bat conservation? How do they get started?
Well, one way is to check with your local university or Department of Natural Resources to see if there are people in your area already studying bats. It certainly is a very good thing to find somebody who already has a state permit to work with bats and learn from them how it's done, how you can do it without harming bats, and perhaps contribute invaluable information on bat needs. There are fair numbers of private citizen projects. Pennsylvania, for example, has a very good one where the state even helps supply bat houses to people who are willing to participate in their monitoring. You also may want to join my organization, Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation, because we routinely provide workshop opportunities where people can go out with us, with experts, and learn how to handle bats safely and collect important information.
Excellent, thank you. And What would you recommend are other ways people can help bats other than installing bat houses?
Well, to the extent possible, try to foster diversity of vegetation. Uh, I see people not far from where I live. I like to used to have time in my sometimes to go down and fly fish as a hobby. And as I'd float down the river, I would see areas where people had bought property and built a home next to the river. And the first thing they do is go in and cut down all the natural vegetation and put lawn in. Next time flood comes by, it washes out the lawn and they're very unhappy. And it doesn't feed the bats either, because the bats need the diverse vegetation to have food along the river. Wherever you are, the more you help protect diverse natural vegetation, you're helping not only bats, but a lot of other animals. And don't needlessly, the first time when a tree dies, people want to cut it down. Consider you might, if a big tree dies, you might cut some of the limbs and things off that could fall on somebody. But to the extent possible, if those are left standing, they can become ideal habitat for bats or woodpeckers or other creatures.
Absolutely. And how would people know if they have bats around?
Interesting question. We're doing research on bat preferences in bat houses and pecan groves right now. And when we started, I told our collaborator, Troy Swift, that he could simply put some cloth or something under his bat houses and look for droppings. And we're going to count the number of droppings to tell when the bats arrived and how the numbers built. But he had a whole set of bat houses that apparently weren't used after the whole first year. And then one morning, his wife was out jogging early, and she went by one of the bat houses and saw bats going in. And so then he watched the bat house and found that he had, I think it was 7 bats living in the bat house. And he didn't know it because there hadn't been any droppings underneath. It appears that there may be some bats that smartly defecate elsewhere to avoid attracting predators. We have never known of this before, so it's something new that we're just learning about. But generally, you'll see droppings under a bat house if bats are using it, and that's the quickest, easy way. Although ants sometimes remove the droppings fairly quickly. I'd look first thing in the morning. The alternate way is to just look into the bat house with a bright light.
Yeah.
May have your bats decide this isn't a good place to live.
Right.
One of our houses that we're currently studying, the first bat that moved in, we had a workshop. Bats that one had moved into one of the houses, and everybody wanted to take a look at it. They all, one by one, shined a light up on the bat. The bat decided he didn't like that. The next night he left, and no bats used that house for the whole next year.
Oh, wow.
So the word got out, this is a place where people will disturb you if you go.
Yeah.
But
you mentioned, go ahead.
You can get away with shining a not too bright light up into a bat house briefly to see if there's bats in it, but also watch it at dusk every now and then and see if bats come out.
Right.
If you can probably use it if they're coming out after dark. You can probably still use a dim red light. Don't shine it right up in the house, but kind of crossways in front, and they'll still come out, and you can count them and know how many bats you got that way.
Excellent. And I'll recommend that if anyone is asking bat house questions that we're not getting to, checking out Merlin's bat house guide has a lot of the answers to those questions in that. And Marilyn, I want to ask you one more question that came through in our comments. Someone early on asked about seeing some of the bat species being listed on the endangered species list. Can you explain what that means for those species?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it helps to be listed because it gives legal protection for bats that might otherwise not be protected. Other times being listed can actually be a detriment because it makes it very difficult for people to study the species. It's so hard to know what to do in these situations. Sometimes the research done to help a species, if not done right, harms the species. And so it's very important to give out permits only for the right kinds of studies that are needed, but don't harm the bats. And having them listed as endangered is certainly a good way to highlight the need of a species to be specially protected. And it can be a powerful tool in ensuring help for the bat. On the other hand, we have to be very careful that we don't sometimes harm the bat by everybody rushing to help and not doing the right kind of research that truly helps.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining that. So I'll end it there, Merlin. I don't want to take up too much of your afternoon here, and I'll just let everybody know that we are going to save this video onto our page, so if they have more questions, they can comment on the video once it's posted, and I can let you know if any big questions come up, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Always happy to help.
Thanks so much, Merlin.
Thank you to everybody for watching.
Yes, have a good day, everybody.